Hello everybody, UB here, and today we're going to talk about alternatives to polymer clay. So let's get started. So, I've always used Super Sculpey or Original Sculpey clay whenever I'm making small sculptures and things like that. But my world kind of got a little bit bigger when I was making barnacles and I had to use air dry clay for the first time. So it became really apparent to me that there are other kinds of clay that I should be playing with and using possibly. But I also recognized that Sculpey, although it's very easy to use, is a polymer clay, which means that it's plastic based. And in going forward in my art, I want to be more conservation and eco-friendly minded as I go forward in the materials that I use especially, and also where I get them. So, since I'm going to be using a lot of clay in the future, I wanted to start off by figuring out what kind of eco-friendlier clay I should be using when I make my little sculptures. As far as Sculpey goes, I love Sculpey, and aside from it being not eco-friendly, it's actually a very kid-friendly and beginner-friendly clay, and I think that's why I was brought up on it in the public school system in my art classes. It does have a little bit more of a finickiness than the other clays that I worked with had, in the sense that because it's plastic-based, you need to knead it before you can really use it out of the package. It has to warm up and become malleable, which is kind of what I was struggling with there. The other thing is you have to bake Sculpey in your normal home oven. So you don't need a kiln to do something in Sculpey necessarily, but you do need an oven at a low temperature. And I've always struggled with baking Sculpey for the right amount of time because I like to put a lot of small details like the blades of grass around the mushrooms here in my sculptures. So those little pieces would burn really easily compared to the rest of my sculpture. And that's where air dry clays actually turn out to be a much better scenario for me. I digress. We'll talk about that more going forward. You can see the end result of the sculpture that I made here, and you can see sort of a sneak peek into the other ones that I made, as I kind of did the sculpting and the painting in stages rather than doing one type of clay at a time. So here I wanted to show you how well each clay took on paint, and Sculpey was not the worst as far as how many coats you really need to get a good base coat, but I wanted to be able to show you for each type of clay what one coat of paint can do. I'd suggest doing at least 3 or 4 coats of your base coat on Sculpey. And I did do this in Original Sculpey, so I have worked with Super Sculpey in the past, and it's very much a similar scenario. I did different paint colors for the different types of clay so that I'd be able to tell them apart, because I did 2 sculptures of one style, 2 sculptures of another. I wanted each one to be a different color so that I could tell which was which. This is basically my control group, the Sculpey. Along with the paint test, I also wanted to test each type of clay by rolling it out in a pasta roller. And for those of you who don't really do a lot of sculpting, this is a very common way of getting large sheets of clay so that you can make your armature and really bulk it out with some other material so that it's not super heavy, just a chunk of clay. And then you can cover that in a sheet of clay instead of, like I said, doing the whole thing solid. And although I didn't do that for these sculptures in particular, I wanted to showcase this very common method. So Sculpey, as far as rolling out, didn't do bad. It was our control, and so it came out pretty smooth. There were some little imperfections and like goobers that you might want to work out of it, but largely it came out smooth. It came out very, very shiny, and that's kind of what I expected from it. So if you've worked with Sculpey before, or any polymer clay, this is basically what you'd be expecting. As far as Sculpey goes, I am going to be giving each type of clay a score out of 30. So what we're going to do here is walk through Sculpey's scores, and then the same categories will apply to each of the sequential clays. So, Sculpey. As far as ease of use goes, it's easy to use out of the package, but you do have to knead it to warm it up, and it has a silky feel, but the paint coverage on Sculpey was probably the worst out of all of the clays. It took a number of coats in order to get a truly good base coat on it. And for that reason, I give it a ease of use score of 4 out of 5. As far as rolling it out, we just talked about that. It was smooth, little bits of chunks kind of come off sometimes, and it's got a ragged edge, but those aren't really reasons to dock it a whole lot. So I also gave it a 4 out of 5 as far as rolling out on the pasta roller. As far as taking small details, which is what I'm really concerned about when I'm making things, Sculpey takes really small details well, and it can get pilly at times. What I mean by that is little chunks will come off with your tool, and you'll kind of have to remove those chunks in order to avoid sort of a grainy sort of situation on your sculpture. But that's not terribly uncommon with clay anyway. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 as far as taking details goes. Shrinkage and drying. The Sculpey has minimal shrinkage, and it does need an oven at a low temp to dry like I was talking about. I gave it a 3 out of 5 in shrinkage and drying because of that need to use a oven, and I also didn't mention this, but it smells terrible when you put it in the oven. It might not be a super strong smell at first, but if you have to bake a lot of different pieces at the same time, it will make your house smell like chemicals. And lastly, I gave it a packaging score. How eco-friendly is the packaging? And I say that Sculpey gets a 3 out of 5 here, mostly because it's in a plastic sleeve, but you can buy it straight from Sculpey, which means that it's traveling less to get to you and spending less gas in order to come to your door, and it comes in up to 24-pound packages, which means less plastic per block if you're going to buy it in bulk. So it gets a 3 out of 5 there. Sculpey is one of our cheaper clays in this scenario, and its price per ounce ranges from 52 cents to 93 cents per ounce. So it all depends on how big of a quantity you're going to buy. So I gave it a 4 out of 5 in the price score, which gives Sculpey a 22 out of 30. That is its final score. Up next is creative paper clay, and spoiler alert, this one was absolutely my favorite by far. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're looking for on packaging to find a more eco-friendly clay real quick. Basically, you're looking for something that is non-toxic, and there's also a certification that you can look for on the packaging or the product description that says that it is safe to use with kids and is therefore a little bit more environmentally friendly. It means that it will break down in a body or in nature a little bit easier. And so that's largely what I was looking for when I looked at each of these different types of clay. As you can see, this is the other mushroom design that I tried to use in this experiment, and inside each of these was actually a little jar that you could screw the top off and put stuff in the jar if you wanted to. The creative paper clay was a lot of fun. I thought it took the details that I wanted it to really well, and it was a little bit brittle. As you can see, the eye stalk on the snail broke off, but it was really easy to put it back on by just wetting down that chunk where it came off and then sticking a new eye stalk on there, and it worked out really well. I'll give you a little bit more detail about the creative paper clay. As far as ease of use goes with the paper clay, it has a very soft and silky kind of texture in your hands. It's very wet. Paper clay is actually a great thing to use for larger sculptures because it's a lot lighter after it dries and cures than the other clays are because it is paper-based. Anyway, ease of use, it's easy to use out of the package. It smooths really easily when you use water. It gets really silky on the outside, and there is some breakage possible in the small details, and the paint coverage here is definitely the worst. You have to use quite a bit of paint to get a good base coat on the paper clay, just because it really soaks all of your paint up right away. But once you get a good base coat on there, it really isn't an issue, and you can kind of see up close what I'm talking about when I talk about this. As far as rolling it out, it's very similar to original Sculpey, but it has a little bit of a gritty texture. It pills off a lot more than the Sculpey or any of the other kinds of clay that I worked with here. As far as taking details, like I said, it took details really well, really fast, but it can become pilly if you're not careful. Shrinkage and drying, this one really had minimal shrinkage. I was very impressed with how little it shrunk, but that also means that you might not have to account for that as much as you're used to if you're used to using polymer clays and that sort of thing. There was very minimal cracking, and that's largely what I'm finding as I work with it more as well. And as far as whether the packaging is eco-friendly or not, it does come in a packaging sleeve, a plastic sleeve. You can get the bricks in either 8-ounce or 16-ounce packages. You can get a 12-pound box directly from Creative Paper Clay if you want to. So I ended up giving the packaging a 3 out of 5 score just because it is packaged in plastic, which is largely what lets it stay moist the way that it needs to, so that you can just get to using it straight out of the package. So those final scores are ease of use, 4 out of 5, rolling it out on the pasta roller, 4 out of 5. Nothing to super complain about, but there are some little nitpicky things with both of those. As far as it taking details, I was super impressed. I gave that a 5 out of 5. I loved it. Shrinkage and drying, I give it a 5 out of 5. Like I said, it didn't really crack for me. And the packaging being eco-friendly, I give it a 3 out of 5. Like I said, not super impressed with the fact that each block is packaged separately in plastic, and the price per ounce is about $1. If you get it in bulk, it's about half that, so it's very similarly priced to original Sculpey. So I gave it a price score of 4 out of 5, and that means that the total score out of 30 is 24, which means it's just a little bit above original Sculpey so far. All right, let's talk about natural clay from Craftsmart. You're probably familiar with this from crafts when you were a kid and that sort of thing. It's extremely cheap, and it's also air dry. I was a little nervous when I got the box in the mail, and I wasn't sure if it was truly air dry or not because they didn't really mention if it needed a kiln or what, but it also didn't say that it was air dry. So I just kind of trusted my instincts and prayed. It turns out it is an air dry clay, so no worries about that. It's also all natural, which is just awesome. It also means it's going to be a little bit heavier than we might like, but I wanted to kind of show you exactly what it looks like straight out of the package. It's got a very similar texture to the paper clay that we just talked about. So with that, I'm going to jump into the categories that I broke these down into and sort of the scores that we're going to be giving the natural clay. Ease of use. It's cheap, it's easy to use out of the package, just like the paper clay. It's easy to paint, and it has a really nice texture. I was really impressed with how well this took paint. Rolling it out, it's really, really flaky. I don't recommend, and I did try to clean my pasta roller really well and then try it again, and it was still flaky. So if you're big into using the pasta roller to roll out your pieces of clay, maybe don't. What I'm showing you on the screen here is that I left this to dry overnight and it cracked all over the place, which is my bad. I would say that it's not a beginner clay necessarily for this reason, but I'll be able to salvage it for sure and wet down my thumb and kind of fill in the creases, or I could go the like Chinese broken pottery filled with gold route. We'll kind of see. We'll see what happens there. But getting back to our rubric, if you will, over here. Taking details, it really does take details well. You can see all the work I did to put into the fur of this moose deer. It was supposed to be a deer. It turned out looking like a moose, but that's okay. It does need a lot of water to continue to use. It does dry out really easily, so you need to have like a bowl of water next to you to keep your hands wet, to keep your block that you're working with wet, and any little pieces that you end up with as you're sculpting, you need to add back to the original block and fold the plastic back over because oofda. As you can see, rolling it out really didn't go well for me, so that is what you're in for if you try to roll this stuff out. Shrinkage and drying, it shrank, it cracked, as you could see, not super beginner friendly, but it doesn't need an oven, so. And whether or not the packaging was eco-friendly, well, it's in a cardboard box, but that cardboard box has a plastic sleeve inside of it. I will say that the plastic is not as thick as the other plastics that I saw packaging the other types of clay, but it also comes in 10-pound packages, and it's one thing of plastic over that 10-pound block, as opposed to with creative paper clay, every pound brick has another sleeve over it. I'd say that's a positive for the packaging of the natural clay. And the shipping prices honestly aren't very good from their original site, but I really liked ordering it straight from Michael's, and that was a lot more reasonable than having it shipped straight to me. So, to give the natural clay its final scores, ease of use, 3 out of 5. Rolling it out, I gave it a 1 out of 5 to be generous. Maybe it was user error, but I'm not really sure. Taking details, I give it a 3 out of 5. Shrinkage and drying, I give it a 2 out of 5. You're really gonna be chasing it to try not to get that cracking, and it is going to take some skill and some practice to get used to that. Packaging being eco-friendly, I give it a 4 out of 5. So it's right up there with creative paper clay. You can get it in the bulk amounts, and that is something that I really enjoy. The price per ounce is about 8 cents. 8 cents per ounce. That's crazy cheap. So I gave the price score a 5 out of 5. So that gives it a total score out of 30 of 18. 18 out of 30. That not being able to roll it in the pasta roller really hurt the chances. So up next is Porcelain Sculpey, and I wasn't sure what to think of this when I first got it. It's by the same company, Sculpey, as the original Sculpey was. This, however, is a porcelain clay, and I heard from the internet that porcelain clay and Premier clay, which is the last clay that we're going to talk about in this video, are both used by doll makers. Largely, I found out about these two from from a Reddit post where another person was curious about the kinds of clay they could use that are more eco-friendly than a polymer clay. You can see that this one is very different in that it's a little bit translucent. It has a very different texture from the rest of them. I definitely have specific uses that I want to return to this clay for because it's so unique in its properties, really. So, ease of use. It has the texture of fondant straight out of the package. It is hard to paint after drying. This was probably 2 coats of paint, and it doesn't really absorb any of the paint. It really just sits on top, so you have to paint it as if you were painting plastic, more or less, which is a weird thing to say about a clay that isn't plastic-based. It's also not vegan, if I remember from my notes right. So keep that in mind. The paper clay is probably a better scenario for somebody who's trying to go with vegan products, but I digress. As far as rolling it out, it's a little bit bumpy when you roll it out, but there isn't any flaking at all like we saw with the natural clay, and it actually rolled out fairly well. I think it was much more of a baseline rollout than the original Sculpey even was. So this has some like little goobers that you might have to pick out or what have you, and that's where it kind of had its own texture going on. As far as taking details goes, it's weird because it forms a skin as you're working with it. So if you take a tool and kind of push on it, it's pushing that skin along with whatever you're trying to do. And I can see why doll makers enjoy it, because that skin that it gets is actually really satisfying. It's very smooth, and I can see for a doll's face or hands how that could be really appealing. You need to keep it wet to keep it from forming that skin, and then that's how you can get slightly more detailed sculpts out of it. Shrinkage and drying, it does weigh itself down. So as that mushroom was drying, it actually changed its shape because it weighed itself down on the wire armature. I would say that that's not a positive. That's not something that I saw in the Premier or the paper clay. It does dry semi-soft overnight, but it needed an extra 24 hours compared to the other clays to truly dry, and it has the most shrinkage. Out of all of the clays that I tested, it shrank a lot, but it didn't crack, which was really cool to see. And the packaging being eco-friendly, it comes in a plastic sleeve, and it has plastic wrap inside of that sleeve. So I'd say this one was probably the worst out of all of the packaging that I saw with these clays. Ease of use, 3 out of 5. Rolling it out, 3 out of 5. It had those goobers, otherwise I would have given it a 4. Taking details, I gave it a 1 out of 5. It really didn't take details well, at least the way that I see details. So there's that, but we talked about the texture being very smooth. So shrinkage and drying, I gave it a 1 because it took a long time to dry and it shrank a lot. Packaging being eco-friendly, I gave it a 2 out of 5 because that's life. And the price per ounce is much higher. It's $1.08 USD. So I gave it a price score of 2 out of 5, which makes its total score out of 30, 12. 12 out of 30. And I stand by that, but I think, like I said earlier, I really see this as a specific use case kind of material. And I stand by using it for things that need to be a little bit translucent or you want to be a lot more smooth. That's sort of the thing that you should keep in mind with all of these clays is you can pick your favorite for the kind of art that you're doing most often, but they each have their own use case that you should really get familiar with each kind in order to have a broader understanding of what type of clay to use where. And last but not least, we're working with the Polymer clay, which was also a doll making clay, like I said earlier. And as far as what we were kind of looking for here, ease of use, it's super wet out of the package. It is very easy to poke through it. It's a super soft clay that way. And it's very, very heavy. I was scared to make the cap of the mushroom larger, like I did with the paper clay, because it was kind of weighing itself down, and you can sort of see that on the brim of the mushroom where I did make it a little bit larger. At that point, I was like, I don't want to screw up this whole thing, so I decided to sort of leave it smaller. With that being said, the paint coverage was very, very good. It was the second best of all of them. I was very impressed with how easy it was to cover this in paint. I think the very porcelain white color was a big part of this because it was a very seamless scenario to put a base coat of color down onto, and it almost felt like there was a base coat already on it because of the color of the clay. Rolling it out, it's super flaky when you roll it out. You'll see that in a minute and I'll comment again, but I was not impressed at all. It was better than the natural clay, but only by a little bit. Taking details, it does take details really well. I would say this was a great alternative to the paper clay if it wasn't so heavy. And they took details similarly. It wasn't as pilly as the paper clay though. It's super easy to use for quick sculpts if you just need to get like a last minute gift done or something like that. This is the clay for you. It dries really fast and, like I said, easy to paint, super easy out of the package. It doesn't really need a whole lot of extra water to use, but it is super wet to begin with. It's best to keep some water around to really smooth things out. Shrinkage and drying, it's basically the same as original Sculpey, so the same as our control. As you can see, I'm starting to roll it out here, and as it comes out, this was almost impossible to get through the pasta roller, and when I finally did get a chunk through, it really was quite flaky, quite gross. Had a very rough texture on the back, which you might want for like a fleshy sort of scenario or something that needs a weird texture like that. But for the average Joe who's just trying to make a smooth, small figurine, this isn't it, if that makes any sense. Lastly, let's talk about the packaging and how eco-friendly it is. It's a plastic sleeve. It comes in 11-ish ounce packages, and you can buy it directly from Activa, which is the company that makes it, but those are pretty small packages. It comes in a plastic sleeve just like the paper clay, just like the porcelain clay, so I'm not super impressed with it, to be honest. And to finish out the rubric, ease of use, I give it a 2 out of 5. I'd say it's fairly easy to do a quick sculpt, but if you're doing something with more details, it's not an easy thing to work with. It breaks really easily, just because it is quite heavy and quite soft. Rolling it out, I give it a 2 out of 5. And taking details, I also give it a 2 out of 5. Shrinkage and drying, I give it a 3 out of 5. It wasn't terrible, and it actually dried much the same as our control group, so that was cool to see. Packaging being eco-friendly, I give it a 3 out of 5. It's very similar to the other ones that we saw. And the price per ounce is the most expensive of all of the clays that I tried out here. So it's $1.32 per ounce, which I gave it a price score of 1 out of 5. And that gives it a total score out of 30 of 13. So it did a little bit better than the porcelain clay, but not by a whole lot. With that being said, our overall winner ended up being the paper clay. I really loved this stuff, and I actually bought a bunch of bulk paper clay to play with going forward and make my sculptures out of. I'll be making more mushroom jars and stuff, so watch out for those on my website. Original Sculpey actually took spot number 2, which is interesting as our control to see that the others didn't quite stack up the way that I would have liked to see them. And then it was fairly closely followed by Natural Clay, the Craftsmart clay that came in a 10-pound block. That stuff's not bad to work with, it's just not super beginner friendly, and I'd keep that in mind if I were an artist going forward. Porcelain Sculpey was our worst, but like I said, it's a very specific use case, and I'm so glad that I got the chance to play with it because now I know where it would be best suited to use it. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. This is 1,000 experience points just for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And please let me know in the comments if you really enjoyed this style of video. My next comparison that I want to do is regular resin compared to bio-resin or eco-resin. For those of you that have been following the channel for a while, you know that I've worked a little bit with resin, but I'm by no means an expert. Thank you so much to my patrons, Mark, Nathaniel, Twyla, and Liam. You guys are rock stars. Thank you so much for enabling me to keep the channel going. Thanks again so much for watching. Don't forget to drink some water, and I'll talk to you again soon. Peace.